Welcome back to part 2 of the Kubota D722 diesel engine resurrection. Today we're going to take a deep dive into the mechanical fuel injection system and resolve an issue with the way this engine was running in the previous episode. So we're going to rebuild the injector pump without using any special tools, and I'll show you what to look out for if you decide to try something like this on your own. You know, it turns out that there's no reason to fear working on these simple injector pumps that are installed on these little Kubota diesel engines. Now, in the previous episode, I took the audience on a mechanical adventure, and this table full of random parts was jammed back onto this engine in an effort to reanimate this abandoned small diesel engine. Now, without hesitation, this tiny little engine coughed back into life, and for the most part it sounded great. Mechanically, well, this engine sounded healthy and there were no unusual sounds. However, there was a problem. The exhaust coming from cylinder number 1 was colder than expected, and the engine had a weird overall note to the exhaust. Well, we did some basic troubleshooting and swapped the injector from number 1 to number 3, and of course number 3 to number 1, and the engine ran the same. Next, we checked the pressure of the crankcase by removing the oil cap and watching if there was enough pressure to blow the cap off the engine. And the good news is, there was no pressure building up in the crankcase. Now, this quick and easy test told us that the piston rings on number 1 were likely in satisfactory condition. Next, we double-checked the valve lash clearance on cylinder number 1, and the valve clearance was within acceptable tolerances. And finally, we put an eyeball on the output hose of the cooling system and watched for any bubbles. Now, if we did have a failing head gasket, there would have likely been combustion chamber pressure escaping into the cooling system and generating a massive amount of bubbles. The good news is, there were no bubbles in the cooling system. Now, the one thing we didn't do was check the compression on cylinder number 1. And in order to check the compression on a diesel engine, you need special tools, which I don't have. You see, since a diesel engine doesn't have spark plugs, well, you can't use a compression tester from a gasoline engine, and you have to check the cylinder pressure using a gauge that can be installed in the injector or glow plug location. Meh, these kits are cheap enough, and I really should get one. But right now, I just don't have one. Anyway, from the simple diagnostics that we did, well, it was looking like we may actually have an injector pump that was starting to fail. So, let's go ahead and remove the pump from the engine and have a good look at it. Perhaps the problem will be something obvious once we dig into it. So here's something that a few people didn't see in the previous video. Now, the fuel return line for cylinder number 1 and cylinder number 2 were still connected to the injector pump right here. Now, keep in mind, this return line was broken, and I had to install a cap on the end to keep the fuel from gushing out of the line. The reason we had fuel gushing out of the line is, well, the fuel supply was being gravity fed to the engine, and without a cap here, the fuel was free to pass right through the pump and drain the supply in a matter of seconds. Anyway, not a big deal, and a loosely installed cap prevented the fuel from spilling out of the system. Now, on the number 3 injector, I capped off one side, but the broken side was still free to weep a little bit of fuel when the engine was running. Again, not a big deal, and this would not have caused the problem we were seeing on the number 1 cylinder. Now, this engine was built in 2012, and according to the propaganda from Kubota, the engine was tested and it performed well on the ultra-low sulfur fuels that was mandated in the US in 2006. Now, I'm not a diesel fuel expert, and some people are saying that the ultra-low sulfur fuel may have caused the pump to fail prematurely. Now, this is interesting because after the 2006 mandate, there definitely was an increase in injector pump failures of all types. And like I said, it's interesting, but it's a rabbit hole that I won't be going down today. And the pump is out. At first glance, the pump looks fine and the rack moves freely. Apparently, these racks can seize up, but this one looks fine, and so that's not a problem. Now, at the bottom of the pump, there seems to be about an even amount of pressure of each one of these plungers. So far, so good. The camshaft for this pump appears to be intact, and there's nothing about it that looks alarming. And just as a side note, this gasket is actually a shim, and its main purpose is to set the timing for the injector pump. You know, if you take the time and peel this gasket apart, typically you'll find that it has 3 layers, and removing 2 of the layers will advance the injector pump timing and provide a modest increase in power. Now, we're going to go ahead and leave the shims alone today because our primary focus is getting this pump to function correctly, and we don't want to introduce a new variable to our already confusing situation. Alright, let's take the injector pump to the bench. Now, I'm going to be disassembling this pump and keeping track of where all the parts came from, so I'll be putting the parts in these 3 bins. This is so I can inspect the parts later and see if there's an obvious problem. Alright, before we disassemble a pump, I want to point out something real quick. In this drawing, we can see this tiny little pin. Now this pin is installed inside the pump on each of the barrels. So there are 3 of them, and unfortunately this pin can fall out when the pump is disassembled. And since this pin is about the size of a grain of rice, it can be easily overlooked. So that's something we need to be aware of. Now the first thing we're going to do is remove these 4 screws that hold this steel plate to the pump body. These screws don't appear to be held in by any thread locker, and I'm using a number 2 screwdriver to remove them. Alright, that's the last one. Now I can remove the steel plate. Well, this guy looks to be in good condition with no signs of corrosion. So this is the fuel rack, and it moves without any effort, so that's good. Now under the rack, there are these 3 nub looking things that engage with the rack, and they're all present and accounted for. And they move nice and easy. Let's pull this retainer clip off next. So these little thingies look like screws, but they aren't. They're just pins that hold the roller plungers to the pump. Now to get them out, just apply a little bit of force to the plunger and pull the pin right out. So this is the plunger thingy that we just removed from the pump. This pin that connects the roller to the plunger can actually fall out, so make sure you handle this plunger carefully. Also, this shim can fall out as well. Now this shim goes in a special way, and the beveled part points down. Alright, now if we dig a little bit deeper, we arrive at what appears to be a spring keeper, and it literally just falls out, which turns out to be normal. Pretty much at this point, all the parts from the lower half of the pump will more or less fall out of the pump, and if they don't, well, try bumping the pump against the table and they'll pop right out. Now don't worry about the orientation of the parts when they come out of the pump. Later on in the video, I'll show exactly how the parts are to be installed. So when the lower part of the injector pump is disassembled, all these parts will be removed with little to no effort. Now over here is something that Kubota calls the element pump. This guy is made up of 2 parts, an upper and a lower part. And in this diagram, you really can't see much of the lower part except for this nub that's sticking out. Anyway, we're going to be calling this thingy the lower part of the element pump. Now as far as the rest of the parts on the lower part of the pump, well, this spring is often a failure point, and apparently it's common to find a broken spring. On our pump, all 3 springs were intact and they appeared to be in excellent condition. So this is the lower part of the element pump that I mentioned a few moments ago. This thingy is what actually pumps the fuel into the injector at extremely high pressure, and this part is subject to wear. And this may be what's causing our problem with the low exhaust temperatures on cylinder number 1. You see, if this gizmo can't generate enough fuel pressure, well, the cylinder won't get enough fuel and we'll have a low temperature on that cylinder. Anyway, this part fits into the pump a certain way, and later in the video I'll explain the correct way to install it. Okay, these nipples need to be loosened, and it's probably easy to do this when the pump is still on the engine. Right now I have the pump in a vise with a cloth to protect the pump from the steel jaws of the vise. So the first nipple definitely needs to be completely removed, and that way you can get access to the middle nipple, which is impossible to remove without first removing the first nipple. So these are all the parts that came out of the section of the pump that provided fuel for cylinder number 1. Now I divided these parts into upper and lower, and that just means which part of the pump they came from. So this spring and this spring were in good condition, and that's definitely not our problem. Overall, these parts are extremely clean, and the problem was definitely not due to garbage in the fuel, so what that means is no chemical cleaners would have solved our problem. Now this guy is the pump element, and it's the part that actually pumps the high pressure fuel. This lower section fits into the upper section, and these are precision fit parts. Anyway, on our engine, this pump element for cylinder number 1 sort of had a loose fit, and it's likely our problem. This assembly is an original Kubota part, and the way I can tell is, well, it has Zexcel engraved into it. Now also note, right over here it's engraved M20. Now this is important when the pump is reassembled. The M20 engraving lines up with this hole. Basically, the way I have these parts is, the element pump fits into the injector pump exactly as I show it here. Now the replacement parts do have M20 engraving, and it's important to be aware that this is a clue to how the pump is reassembled. Now this groove is also very important. When this pump element is installed in the injector body, this groove will line up with this pin over here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this pin can actually fall out of the injector pump body when the pump is disassembled, and without this pin in place, well, the pump element will not be correctly aligned. So here's a funny story. I didn't know this pin existed, and when I reassembled this pump for the first time and tested it, well, this is what happened. Yep, and diesel talk, that's what they call a runaway. And it ain't good. Now, fortunately, I had a 17mm wrench handy so I could cut the fuel for each of the cylinders and safely shut the engine down. Now, the reason the engine didn't completely shut down when I blocked the intake manifold is it was still sucking air through this open hole. Now, the good news is cylinder 1 definitely works fine, and we can rule out any potential issues with compression or the valves not sealing properly. Although I don't recommend using this method to test it. So yeah, this groove needs to line up with the pin inside the pump, and if you somehow lose the pins, then find them fast. Now, I did manage to find the missing pins in the container that I used to wash the pump, and I'll show you how to install them in a few moments. Now, over here is the delivery valve, and basically this is a one-way valve or a check valve. Anyway, this could actually be our problem as well. These delivery valves do not come with the injector pump rebuild kit, but they can be easily replaced while the pump is still installed in the engine, so for now we won't worry about this. So this is how all the gizzards fit inside the injector pump, and remember, the M20 engraving faces the same direction as the groove and the hole in the upper part of the pump element. Oh, and one more thing. This shim fits inside the roller plunger and the bevel side faces the roller plunger assembly. It's kinda obvious how it fits, but if you're not paying attention, you can install it upside down. Now, this picture is worth 1,000 words or 1,000 pictures or something like that. What I mean to say is, it's far easier to show you how all the parts fit together here than to show you when I assemble the pump. So, pay attention to this picture if you need help assembling the pump. Now with the microscope, I was able to inspect all the parts thoroughly, and I couldn't find an obvious defect in any of the parts. However, the pump element for cylinder number 1 was certainly looser fitting than the ones for the other 2 cylinders, so I reckon it's possible for the parts to look fine, but it's the fitment of the parts in the pump element that make the difference. Now, just a quick note, after discovering the pump element on cylinder number 1 was suspect, I didn't dig into the pump any further. Now in this picture, you can see the anti-tamper screws on each of the barrels. Now it turns out the position of these barrels is factory set, and removing these screws to pull the barrels out would upset the factory calibration. So if you're doing a quick pump refresh, you want to avoid digging any further. Otherwise, you'll have to deal with calibration issues. Now I may do a deep dive into this aspect of the injector pump in a future video, but for now, we're going to leave this stuff alone. Alright, let's put this pump back together. So this little guy is the pin that's used to align the pump element, and I know exactly where it's going to be going this time around. So if we look inside the window of the injector pump body, we can clearly see 3 little holes, and to avoid future problems, we want to install these pins in the holes right now. To install the pins, it's going to require using tweezers because the holes are in an awkward position, and with a little effort, the pins will drop right in. The rebuild kit I'm using is a low-cost generic kit because, well, that's what most people would use. Now, there's definitely mixed reviews on these cheapo kits, and perhaps it would be better to use genuine Kubota parts. Now, I can tell you right off the bat, these larger springs fit okay, but not great, so I ended up not using them. However, I did use the delivery valve springs. I'll probably keep my original springs in a safe place just in case these fail. Anyway, with the pins in place, now we can install the new pump element in the injector body. This part uses the pins that we just installed to ensure perfect alignment, and the groove in this part will line up with the pins when it's inserted into the pump body. Now, if we take a closer look, we can clearly see the exposed pins on these 2 barrels. Whenever the pump element is inserted into the pump body, it would be wise to confirm the pins are still in place before inserting the pump element. The delivery valve is next. Now, this valve is actually in 2 parts, and we first insert this section with the flange facing down, and it goes in just like this. This is the other part of the delivery valve, and it's inserted into the thingy we just installed in the pump. And next we install this washer. Now, this washer is a precision part, and the injector pump actually won't work without using this washer. Next, we can install the delivery valve spring, and it goes in like this, but it's actually easier to install it in the nipple and then install the nipple onto the injector pump. Next is this thingy, and it's installed with the nub pointing up, and it should slide right in. Now, if it's seated correctly, you should clearly see the nub through the window. Next is the spring collar, and it also slides right in. Actually, if you're having trouble inserting this part, you could probably use the spring to push it all the way in. Okay, now we have to install the lower part of the pump element. To install this guy, the window of the pump body needs to be facing up, and the M20 engraving on the lower part of the pump element needs to be facing down. Insert this part a little bit, but not all the way. Next, we can install the spring, which drops right in. And now we can install the spring keeper. The spring keeper engages with the lower part of the injector pump element like this. Next, we can install the roller plunger with the shim, and keep in mind the bevel part of the shim faces down. Once the roller plunger is inserted, you should be able to push it in and feel the spring tension. Sometimes, you need to wiggle this nub a little bit in order for the roller plunger to fit correctly. Now, once everything's lined up properly, you should be able to push the roller plunger in far enough to install the retaining pin. If all goes well, the pin will pop right in. And in this close-up, you can see the nub is still centered. Now, this nub should move freely without any binding. Now, if it does bind, go ahead and double check everything. Anyway, at this point, the rest of the pump can be assembled exactly the same way as we did in this section. Fast forward and the pump is almost completely assembled, and now we have to install the retaining clip. When the clip is properly installed, it should fit like this. And finally, we can install the rack. Make sure that it engages with each of the nubs properly. Once the rack is in position, it should move freely without any binding. At this point, we can install the metal plate that holds the rack in position. And that's pretty much it. Putting this thing back together the right way was easy peasy, and as long as the lower pump element is inserted the correct way, there's nothing about this that's difficult. Alright, let's see if this thing works. Off camera, I went ahead and installed the injector pump. Now, apparently, we don't have a lot of time today, and it's fixing to start raining in a few minutes. Let me go ahead and purge the air from the high pressure lines, and we can start this tiny engine up. Okay, that should be good enough to get this engine started, and once it's running, it'll sort itself out. Now, just in case, I'm definitely going to be keeping this 17mm wrench nearby, but hopefully we won't need it. Clear prop. Alright, it definitely wants to run, so we did something right. I have to say, this little guy doesn't sound happy today, but it may still have some air bubbles in the system. Now this is interesting. All three exhaust ports are about the same, but they're only blowing warm air. Wow, I really didn't expect that. Let me get this thing connected to the garden hose so we can let the engine run a little bit longer and see how it does after all the air bubbles work through the fuel injection system. Fast forward a few minutes, and after running the engine for about 5 minutes off camera, it's running a lot better. And best of all, the exhaust temperatures are even on all the cylinders, and all three cylinders are just blowing warm air, which on a diesel engine, this is pretty much normal at idle. You see, diesel engines run really lean, and the leaner they run, the colder the exhaust. It's actually the opposite of a gasoline engine. Anyway, it appears the operation was a success, and all three cylinders have about the same exhaust gas temperatures now. Outstanding! This fills my heart with joy to hear this little engine purring like a kitten. Ah, the simple things in life. Okay, fast forward a few minutes, and I went ahead and put the exhaust manifold back on the engine. Let's fire it up. Oh yeah, it's definitely going to be a good runner. I could listen to this thing all day. You know, this is music to my ears. Well, it was a lot of work to get this engine back together and up and running. Perhaps I can ask you folks to click on the like button, and if you're not already subscribed to the channel, consider doing so because it really helps this channel out a lot, more than you can ever imagine. And if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a patron member. I truly appreciate all the support from my patrons. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the challenge of getting this little engine back together and up and running again. Hopefully you folks did as well. Now, for the next challenge, well, we have this monster that's been lurking in the garage, and it sort of runs, but it has a lot of problems that we need to deal with. Can it be saved, or is it going to be off to the scrapyard with it? Well, tune in next week and find out. We'll see you next time. Until then.